Hey everybody, welcome to the Fired Up with CJ show. Today we have Dr. Christopher Kerr, who is the CEO and Chief Medical Officer at the Hospice at Buffalo, and we're talking about his book, Death is But a Dream, Finding Hope and Meaning at Life's End. And so in the previous segment, we were talking about, um, you know, acute death, which is a death in which you don't really have any time to adjust and transition to the idea of death. And during the time in between these sessions, you were talking about that oftentimes medical professionals actually put people in that acute form. And I wanted to find out what you meant by that and how medical professions could be more um, on caring or educated about this process of dying.
Sure. I mean, as a medical culture, we're pretty death phobic and death denying. And so what we often see is patients who are clearly dying, yet they have very little awareness
Mm,
of their prognosis. And there's some really good data on this. If you're trying to predict your survival within 6 months, you're kind of better off flipping a coin. And so what happens too often is that the patient finds out very close to dying that there isn't an opportunity to treat or cure or to hold back the progression of the disease. So it feels like it's acute, but it was really forecastable many, many months ago.
mm,
And that causes an incredible amount of harm, mostly for the loved ones who all of a sudden have to pivot. Unfortunately, we're a world class healthcare system when you're curative, and then you kind of fall off this cliff when you're no longer curative.
mm.
And it makes it very hard on families. And we have an inpatient unit here where there's 22 beds. It's not uncommon for us to receive a patient from the hospital, and they only found out that they were actually dying 24 hours earlier when it was probably forecastable 24 months earlier.
Mm.
Um, the strategy that should be taken is one in which, we're going to fight like hell, but we also need to prepare for the worst. So hope for the best, prepare for the worst. And when we see that strategy taken, people die differently
Mm.
and their families process loss differently. For example, it's not uncommon that we have, a mother with young children, and they're only finding out days before she's gone that she's actually terminal.
Oh, wow.
A third of our patients are in for less than 7 days.
Wow.
So we treat with the only thing that's really acute is the awareness of the physician to have the conversation. Um, Medically, the trajectory was really clear.
Hmm. So I've heard. So I had a friend who had lymphomic cancer, I think, and she had said that her prognosis was very like, oh, you have like a certain number of years to live, unless you get this operation, which she elected to do. Not this operation; it was like some blood transfusion thing, and so she elected to do that. But there was this kind of hoping for the best idea, which is like, I'm going to fight this. I'm going to, like, just thinking the worst was actually creating the worst. And so I don't really know how someone manages positive thinking with not going into denial, right? I mean, she had been told, like, if you get the surgery, you'll have like 3 or 5 more years to live. If you don't get the surgery, you'll die in 12.
Yeah.
So, how does someone manage that? Because I think
Well,
that's why we go into that denial state.
yeah, I think because we treat it like it's a binary thing,
Yeah.
and it's really not. And I think by creating a better sense of realism,
Mm,
and we also don't put enough definition around it. So what does dying look like, or what does getting worse look like?
mm-hmm.
And so people aren't able to self-inform. It's remarkable to see people who are weigh 80 pounds, aren't eating, and surprised that they're not going to live.
Right.
But they're not given enough data points to put it together.
Mm.
The best example I can tell you is that we get people from the hospital who honestly know what the price of coffee is, where to park at the hospital, but they don't actually know how or when they're going to die.
Mm. Wow.
It's really particularly in a time when autonomy is everything, self-informing is everything, control of your own information, all of that sort of thing. But we often don't use that when it comes to our own mortality.
Right.
Uh,
Yeah, and I thought when your TEDx video, one of the things that you had said that I thought was so interesting. As you talk about pre-death visions, which I want to go into what those are, and you said 80% of the people had pre-death visions. So they had like, that was almost like their, maybe it's time that you're going to die, because you were saying that most of them had these visions that before they're about to die, there's a correlation between these visions and death you even had in your video. Can you tell us a little bit about pre-death visions, and then
Sure.
how they may be one marker? I mean, I clearly, if you're 80 pounds, there is some like, there's some physical evidence, but what are other pieces
Yeah,
of
but
evidence?
you would be surprised how many people are dependent on the doctor, informing them. So if they haven't given it really told them that, then they often don't actually self-realize. It's actually
Uh,
because if you think about it, particularly with cancer, it's a culture where we fight and we're going to beat. And so it's almost like signing up for a cult, which you're not allowed to think outside of that paradigm.
right.
So you honestly don't, you are not able to recognize certain realities because that would be giving into something that's counter to what you're supposed to believe in. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
Uh,
That's exactly what I heard of a dear friend of mine. That's what she was told. You've got to beat this. You can't think. It is like a cultish belief.
well, the absurd thing about that that actually really bothers me, is that the body does what the body can do. And people don't fight less because they happen to succumb to their illness.
Right.
Uh, I don't see that. I see people fighting. So to frame it in those ways, it's really it obscures the realities that people
Mm,
to accept. And again, I'm not suggesting you don't fight like hell, but also recognize other aspects. There's other dimensions to illness,
mm.
and sometimes
What's a better frame then? If the frame of like fight like heck, be in this culture of like can do attitude. What is a and then you and what I'm hearing you say is like be realistic. Like it's basically a reality based one. What would be a different frame that you could put yourself in?
I think it's the idea that know certain facts. So if I do this treatment regimen, I've got 80%. But realistically, I have to understand there's a 20% that this won't happen this way.
Mm-hmm.
And I need to prepare my loved ones and myself for that
Mm,
reality. It doesn't change your will to live. It just it allows you to take everything on, with wider eyes.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because I've been watching as we're hitting this crisis where we're all contemplating our own death, just watching the different responses because one of them is denial. It's just kind of I'm going to watch, and I actually have mixed feelings about that. You know, one is I'm just going to watch funny videos and get myself out of this funk, which I think, yeah, elevate your energy and your mood, and then the other is like I'm not going to watch news. I'm not going to get myself educated on what's happening. And there is kind of a, well, how are you going to manage this? I mean, you're managing your emotional
Yeah.
strategy by being in denial. But then how do you also look at the reality? Like,
Yeah.
you need to be careful when you go to the grocery store. I mean, I don't know how
Well,
one does that.
I can tell you from a medical perspective, there's
Yeah.
no greater injury than the physician who says, I don't want to tell them the truth or let them know about the risks here
Mm.
because I don't want to take away hope.
Oh.
That would be a great approach if you could actually keep them from their own reality. But eventually people figure it out,
Mm.
and
Right.
then they feel violated. They actually feel harmed.
Right.
So in other words, somebody knew something about me that actually affected my life,
Oh, wow.
and you didn't. It's just a very old paternalistic attitude, that actually harms people in the end, because they would have made different choices.
Mm.
You know,
Well, yeah.
practically, I had somebody recently who told his daughter not to come in from California because he thought he had another 6 to 12 months, and then he finds himself dying in 3 weeks.
Mm.
So again, you're not allowing people to process and adapt in real time to real situations by denying them the certain
Right.
realities.
Well, as a doctor, what I'm hearing, here's what I'm putting together that I didn't get until you just explaining that is that most doctors, you say, are in the state of defying death. and not being an administrator of the bad news. Like, it probably because they themselves are having problems with the defying death part, they have a hard time dealing with death, let alone telling someone that they're going to die in, in 3 weeks or versus 6 months, And so how do you, in some ways, once the physician gets okay with the idea of dying, then they can actually administer more truthful information to patients. But it
Yeah.
seems like that's part of the problem, right? Because if the physician is not comfortable with death, which you're saying the vast majority are not, then
Well,
they, yeah,
if I can just give a caveat to that,
yeah.
it's actually not all the physician's fault. It's a cultural issue. So we are so technically enamored that we think there's always something you can do about something.
Mm, mm-hmm,
And we're also an ageist society that fights like hell to avoid inevitabilities,
mm-hmm,
like decline. But I mean, if you look at the commercials, for example, the Cancer Centers of America, they're basically selling hope.
mm.
So it's there's a my point is there's it's more than the physician.
Yeah,
There's also a cultural component
totally fair. Yeah, I
that
get it.
our grandparents' generation they actually understood death. They were more proximate to it. They saw it. They didn't fear it in the same way. I mean, they had seen, for example, those who lived through the influenza pandemic, the wars. But we as a culture are death denying.
Right. Well, we haven't had to face this kind of epidemic ever. I mean, that kind of thing. And most of the people who are alive now, they haven't had that in our lifetime, so we don't know how to deal with it. So I
Yeah.
do, that's a really good point. You're
Well,
saying,
we've also sterilized it, just
yeah,
like birth. So people used to be born in their home. Now
yeah,
they're born in hospitals. People used to die with their families.
yeah,
Oh, they die in institutions. So
yeah, yeah. It's interesting. I think that your point being that it's not just the doctors. The doctors are part of
not
a
at all.
culture, the culture of which wants technology to solve everything, and that we're going to defy death and everything that we turn around, and that's kind of how we're trained to think, versus accepting death as a natural process that
Yeah.
happens in life. So, in the next segment, we're going to talk a little bit about your research and what you
Sure.
found through. And that it's featured in your book, Death is But a Dream, Finding Hope and Meaning at the End of Life. You've been talking to Dr. Christopher Kerr, who is the CEO and Chief Medical Officer at the Hospice at Buffalo. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
It means so much to me that you're listening to the show. Would love your support in any way by giving me comments below, or to subscribe to the show, or share the show with friends. Thank you again for your support. Love and blessings.